So we're going to talk about Gestalt theory. We have an extra PDF, which will be posted on Canvas, and I'll tell you what pages to specifically focus on. So essentially, Gestalt theory is how people perceive things. So we have these two quotes. All else is equal. Elements that are related by X tend to be grouped perceptually into higher order units, and then the whole is other than the sum of its parts. So it's basically an explanation of human perception in groups of objects and how we perceive parts of objects and how we form whole objects basis on these laws. So how we perceive things with different signals coming in, instead of every single object coming in, our brain will organize things to simplify things so we can have a better understanding. So Gestalt is actually a German word, which means pattern, figure, form, or structure that is unified. And the main thing we want to think about when we think about Gestalt theory is unification. So there was this movement in Berlin in like the 1920s, and it was about pretty much psychologists were wanting to make sense of how we see whole forms and how we understand them rather than individual elements. So think of someone close to you. It could be your friend, your partner, your parents. What do you think of when you see their face? Now, there's different elements. Everyone has eyes, mouths, noses. Instead of thinking of each individual part when we think of someone we close, we think of all the parts unified together. And that's Gestalt theory, how we make sense of this organization. So let's look at these two rooms. Now close your eyes. Now, which one of these pictures do you recall first? Most likely it's the one on the left because it's unified and it makes sense. Everything's in an order that makes sense to us. We expect a room to look like the image on the left versus the image on the right. When we think of Gestalt theory, I basically pare it down to like goes to like. And that's kind of the overall simplification of Gestalt theory. So there's several different laws that we're going to explore that make up Gestalt theory. And the first one is law of prognos, or however you pronounce it, basically the law of figure and ground. So it's the idea we perceive in a visual field, either in a photograph, it could be a website, is that some objects take a prominent role, which are figure, and while others recede into the background, which is ground. So whole figures definitely are separate out. We see this separation within contrast, color, size, and even conceptual links as well. So a simple composition could have one figure, a person, background of a park. Or a complex composition could be having several people. Maybe there's a hot dog cart, maybe there's ducks in the background, ducks going around, and then there's the background. But the background could have just as much valuable visual information. So a lot of times designers, and we'll see in our examples, that everything isn't just figure and ground. And the attention will shift back and forth, which is really fun to play with as a designer, how you can push the viewer's eyes back and forth. It's fun to have some ambiguity. So in this image, we can obviously tell the figure is the Brooklyn Bridge. It's got that bright contrast, very vivid, very bold against the background. We're taking different tools of visual perception to really tell the viewer what's important, the figure, and then versus what's not as important, the ground. Now the ground still has some great detail. And we're looking at a lot of times some ambiguity. So probably the first thing you see in this image is those long smokestacks and the power plants, or whatever have them. But then you may see a figure of a woman with her mouth open and her hand up. And this is kind of fun to play with this ambiguity, where you can push back and forth. So you're following the normal rules of the figure and ground, but where you can give that nice tension back and forth, which in turn causes the viewer to look further for these clues. Now, which did you notice first? Do you notice the two animals looking at each other or the tree? So really playing with positive, negative relationships is a very interesting design tool. And you can hide parts of storytelling with it as well. So the law of proximity is, if you look at the textbook, and I talked a lot about grouping, is that objects or shapes that are close to one another appear to form groups or objects. So these objects, they don't have to be the same shape, size, or object themselves. They just have to physically be close to each other. And this is how you can define shapes and planes within a visual field. You can group with tone, value, color, shape, size, what have you, as long as they're physically close to each other. So in this image, we have two groups. The squares in the top of the image don't appear to be in a single group, versus the ones in the bottom seem to be a unified whole, even though they are not touching. Michelangelo's creation of Adam, and you've seen this in your classes before, and it appears to be a unified group, but the figures are not touching, and there's something great about that tension, but they appear to be connected, which is something that really helped the conceptual focus of this painting. Now you could see, first thing I see is sort of this sort of kind of X-looking figure, but then I'm taking a moment to look at these unified marks, which is of these people, but I don't see them as individuals, I see them as an overall group. Again, these butterflies are different shapes, different sizes, but they're unified by their closeness. They're also unified by their tone as well. More unification to create a larger image, which also kind of works, a little figure ground because you see the leaves. You can mix and match all of the Gestalt theory laws, and I heavily encourage it. So the law of symmetry, which has a lot to do with composition, which we'll talk about in the next few weeks. And we'll talk about balance and symmetry. Now, we're not quite there yet, but this could be something you pull around, especially with 1.3 in your set 1 with that studio action. But we perceive objects as symmetrical shapes that form around the center. So most objects can be divided by two or more symmetrical halves. So symmetry states the viewer should not be given the impression that something's out of balance, missing, or wrong. So if you present a composition that's out of balance or doesn't have a good symmetry, it causes some uncomfortable tension as the viewer. We don't want to look at it. We're going to spend time thinking what's missing, what's wrong, why doesn't it fit? And we're more interested in why it doesn't work, and we're kind of turned off, and it makes us feel uncomfortable. So we're going to view something else. However, you may use this once you've mastered all the Gestalt theory principles, of course, but you can use it that you want emphasis on that discomfort of a composition that doesn't work. Now remember, all rules are meant to be broken only if you break them well. So again, humans like order, we like stability, we like consistency, like structure. Think of going to a website that you've never been to before, an online shopping experience. Now, you don't want to have to think too hard about how to navigate to get to the shoes you want to, that is my dog. The shoes you want to buy, because you want to have order and consistency. People like being able to open something in a box and figure out how to use it without being too much effort. That's why Apple is so successful. Think of traffic signs. Traffic signs, even if they're all consistent. We understand what they mean. Now we look at balanced compositions. Viewers look at this and it makes them feel comfortable. We like looking at things that are balanced. Now we look at this website and it's very unbalanced. There's a lot of negative space. Things are too far. We don't want to look at it. And then, of course, the other things with the color and the Comic Sans, but that's not part of the balance. But it makes it difficult for us to look at. We don't want to engage in something that doesn't show good symmetry. Predictability. And a lot of this comes with patterning. And sometimes objects don't have to be in perfect symmetry, but to be balanced. And we will talk a little bit more about this in the next few weeks when we get into our composition lecture. But the key thing is to have balance. The law of similarity. So the law of similarity states that objects which things share visual characteristics that are alike will be seen as they belong together. This is again as overall like goes to like. So we have this image here. We have blue circles, yellow squares, and red triangles. Now we do not see this all as one unified whole. We see this as sort of circles that go together. They're in a line, they're close to together. Again, proximity, we're pulling that in. The yellow goes together, and the red goes together. And we see them as separate parts. Here's an example of similarity. Everything goes together. Now, a lot of this, again, heavily influenced on pattern and rhythm. We expect the things to go together. Think of as a child when you had to organize things by your toys by category. You put all your cars together, all of your dolls together. Maybe you did, okay, all of my red cars together and my yellow cars, but then I have my trucks, and my trucks go together. People tend to put things in categories. It makes them simple. Think of color coding. I color code all my information for each of my classes so I know which class gets what. So I color code thing, and I use the law of similarity to help me understand and expect things. Often we look for harmony and interconnectedness with similarity. And sometimes when objects break the rules of similarity, we're really drawn to it. We're drawn to why is it different, and that's where our eye will go because it breaks the pattern. And we can definitely use that as our emphasis to really give us that focal point. You want to tell the viewer what's important. Where do we focus on? So sometimes breaking this rule really emphasizes that. Now we have this Andy Warhol. And while all the images are of Marilyn Monroe, we see them all as different because the colors and the schemes are very different. We don't see a lot of similarity here. We see them as separate parts. Now again, we see the form, okay, they're all together, but visually, quickly, we're not going to group them all as a single group. The law of closure. So we close up things that are not actually closed up. So again, like I said, our brain likes patterns. We look for what's the missing details and we will connect them together. Remember doing connect the dots where you kind of do the lines together, and sometimes you can see the picture before you even start connecting dots. And that's because our brain wants to make these connections for us. So our brain is definitely filling in the holes that are missing, which is a good way to kind of push and pull and add some sort of dynamic, sort of texture and value to a composition. Finally, the law of continuity. So elements that are visually associated because they're perceived to align with each other. So we're going to take these lines. Remember, we heavily talked about lines in our 2D elements lecture, but we see them as sort of simple figures that we follow along. Points us where we need to look at, and sometimes these lines kind of interweave within each other. So we see this H and these lines that kind of pull us to the right. We're telling the viewer where to look. Same thing in this image. Again, drawing our viewer's eye. So definitely take some time to, when you look at design, whether it be of a website, a poster, maybe you're at the art gallery this weekend, and think about how these artists and designers use Gestalt theory and how you can start integrating, bringing it into your practice. So I hope you kind of think about that. There will be some extra reading to kind of hammer out these ideas, and I expect to see you start implementing Gestalt theory within your studio actions.